Police? The man at number 12 is prowling around the foot of the dam again, and he's been there since before sunrise. I want you to come down here and remove him right now. Darlene Prescott hadn't even lowered the phone when Grayson Hale slipped the measuring device into a cloth bag and walked straight toward her. Mrs. Prescott, this road isn't your private police station, he said, his voice deep and so calm, it was almost infuriating. You've only lived here a few weeks, she retorted, but every morning you're wandering around the dam with all that equipment. I was a deputy sheriff for 30 years. I have a responsibility to report suspicious people. Are you reporting a danger, or are you using a title you retired from to drive away a neighbor? What law in the state of Georgia does a carpenter break by taking a morning walk? Don't lecture me about the law. Here in Cypress Hollow, I know exactly who the dangerous people are. Then you should look down at your feet, he replied. Even your dog noticed it before you did. Beside Darlene, Bruno, the old Neapolitan Mastiff, wasn't looking at the stranger at all. He lowered his head and drew a deep breath over the yellowed grass at the foot of the dam, then suddenly began clawing hard at the ground, pulling the leather leash tight. Bruno, stop! But the dog wasn't wrong. Beneath that grass, something had been cracking apart for 10 years without anyone knowing, and the only man searching for it was carrying a secret even more dangerous than the dam itself. If you believe the truth deserves to be brought into the light, leave a like, share this video with someone you love, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the journey for justice that begins right now. 8 weeks before that morning, an ash-gray pickup truck loaded with wooden crates stopped in front of the house at number 12 Honeysuckle Lane. The man who stepped out was alone, tall and broad-shouldered, and if anyone had looked closely at his hands, they would have seen calluses unlike those of a carpenter. But in Cypress Hollow, no one looked that closely. All they saw was a furniture restorer from somewhere else, who had rented the old house that had stood empty for years, carried 4 pine crates, secured with 2 locks each into the garage with his own hands, refused the driver's offer to help, and arranged everything in silence like a man accustomed to doing important things without needing anyone there to witness them. That afternoon, while he was pulling the tarp off the planing bench on the porch, Mrs. Darlene Prescott crossed the patch of yard separating the 2 houses, a glass of iced tea in her hand as an excuse, her eyes doing nothing to hide her real purpose. She asked whether he was the new owner or only renting. He said he was renting, with a 6-month lease. She introduced herself by name and added that she was a retired county deputy sheriff, saying it slowly and clearly as though the title were part of her name, then waited for some sign of intimidated respect. Grayson merely nodded politely, and his calm seemed to irritate her more than any challenge could have. She asked what he did for a living. He said he restored antique furniture and was looking for a quiet town where he could open a workshop. She asked where his wife and children were. He replied quietly that he was raising his daughter alone after losing his wife, adding that his family was currently in Boston, and once he got settled, he would decide what came next. She glanced toward the garage and asked what was inside the crates. He said they held expensive tools, locked up for safety. Every answer was true, and none of them contained enough of the truth. But Darlene didn't realize it. She only felt that every question she asked seemed to slide over this man, without leaving so much as a scratch. She told him people in this neighborhood kept an eye on one another. That was how Cypress Hollow stayed peaceful. Grayson replied that he appreciated thoughtful neighbors, and he appreciated reasonable boundaries too. The words made her pause for a beat. At that exact moment, Bruno, who had been lying beside her feet, suddenly stood, abandoned the greeting halfway through, wandered toward the base of the dam, and lay down there stubbornly. No matter how many times she called, he wouldn't come back, and she finally had to go down and drag him away herself. Grayson stood on the porch watching, memorizing the precise spot where the dog had lain, about 20 paces from the base of the dam, where a strip of grass had faded to a different color from the rest. He said nothing. He had learned long ago that the most valuable details were often the ones other people didn't know you possessed. Night fell, and the lights in number 12 stayed on until late. Grayson sat at the kitchen table, took out his wallet, and removed a photograph worn soft at the corners, the one thing he had carried with him everywhere for 10 years. In the picture, a young woman was smiling, holding her accounting degree high in one hand, while the young man beside her was looking at her instead of the camera, with the gaze of an older brother who believed there was nothing in the whole world his little sister couldn't overcome. Fiona Hale, 26 years old, the youngest accountant ever hired by the largest property management company in the county. She had called him one rainy night 10 years earlier, her voice trembling but determined, telling him she had found something big in the books, that she had copied enough documents, and that in 3 days she would take everything to the state office. She told him not to worry. Everything was going to be all right. That was the last call she ever made to him. 3 days later never came for Fiona. The official record said that a sudden flash flood had swept through the pumping station area at the foot of the dam, taking 3 lives, including that of a young woman who just happened to be driving along the low road beside the lake. A natural disaster, they said. And no one could be held responsible for a natural disaster. Grayson set the photograph down and pulled a small folding knife with a cherry wood handle from his pocket. The gift he had given his sister on the day she got the job, the only thing they returned to him among her water-soaked belongings. He turned the knife slowly in his hand, like a habit that had worked its way into his bones. 10 years had been enough time for a lost young man in Boston to climb into a position where even the most powerful men in the city became cautious when they spoke his name, and none of them knew that inside Grayson Hale's private safe, there was always a thin file on a small town in Georgia, an aging dam, and 3 deaths neatly filed beneath 2 words, natural disaster. He could have come here another way, using the methods the underworld had always used to collect its debts, but Fiona hadn't believed in that way. His sister had believed in documents, in signatures, in justice written in black ink on white paper, so he would collect this debt her way, with evidence, with the law, by dragging the person responsible into the light where the entire town could see. Grayson folded the knife closed and looked through the dark window, where the shadow of the dam stretched beneath the moon like an old scar cutting across the town. He hadn't come here to work with wood. He had come to reopen a case that had been closed, and this time, no rain would wash the truth away. On the morning of the 2nd day, Grayson was reinstalling the hinges on the garage door when he heard a light knock against the frame of the front gate. A young woman stood there, her brown hair tied low, holding a plate covered with a checkered cloth, and her smile was the first one he had seen in this town that didn't seem to have a probing question hidden behind it. She introduced herself as Josie Whitfield, from number 14 across the way, said she taught elementary school at the town school, and explained that the plate held zucchini bread she had baked the night before, because in Cypress Hollow people still kept the old custom of bringing something homemade to welcome a newcomer. Grayson accepted the plate with a wariness skillfully hidden beneath good manners, waiting for the familiar questions, but they never came. Josie only asked whether he had found a decent place to buy food yet, named the one restaurant worth trying for its apple pie, and warned him to avoid the gas station on the south side, because the pumps cheated customers out of a few cents on every gallon. She spoke about the town in the voice of someone who belonged to it down to every brick in the sidewalk, and Grayson realized that kind of sincerity was harder to deal with than suspicion. Suspicion he knew how to evade, but kindness simply stood there asking for nothing, leaving a person with the uncomfortable sense that he owed something in return. Before leaving, she turned her head toward the dam at the end of the road, and her eyes rested there a beat longer than a casual glance should have. Then she looked away quickly, said goodbye, and crossed the yard. He took note of it without understanding it yet, and filed that look away in the same corner of his memory as the faded strip of grass and the old dog that had refused to leave the base of the dam. Near dusk, a small delivery truck pulled up in front of number 12, carrying 3 tarp-covered bundles, whose paperwork identified them as kiln-dried walnut. The delivery man had barely lowered the first bundle when, across the yard, the curtain in Darlene's house shifted. Grayson didn't need to look to know what was happening. He deliberately stood in the middle of the walkway and slowly signed each delivery receipt, allowing every movement to be exposed beneath the porch light, like part of a performance. Less than 10 minutes after the truck drove away, a patrol car turned onto Honeysuckle Lane. No emergency lights, no siren, but it stopped precisely in front of number 12. Grayson glanced at his watch. 6 minutes from the moment the curtain next door had dropped for the last time. The man who stepped out was a young deputy, whose nameplate read Lawson, and the first thing he did wasn't walk toward the homeowner. Instead, he cut diagonally across the yard to Darlene's front steps, where she somehow already stood waiting. The two spoke for nearly 2 minutes, and Grayson watched the way the deputy dipped his head slightly as he listened, the familiar nod of a soldier before a former superior, even though there hadn't been a badge of rank on her shoulders for years. Only then did Lawson cross over, his tone mild, saying someone had reported a suspicious delivery, and that he was merely following procedure to verify it. Grayson produced the lease agreement, his identification, and the invoice for the lumber, then calmly asked which county ordinance prohibited a wood delivery at 7 o'clock in the evening. Lawson examined the documents, handed them back, admitted there had been no violation, gave a proper farewell, and left. But before getting into his car, he stopped beside the fence and exchanged a few more words with Darlene, and she nodded with the expression of someone who had just completed an assignment. That night, Grayson opened a dark brown leather-bound notebook, the kind he used for things that weren't allowed to be forgotten, and wrote 3 lines. The first line said that a report had been made about a lawful delivery through the non-emergency line. The second said a patrol car had arrived 6 minutes later, faster than the response time for many actual burglaries. The third said the deputy had spoken to the caller before speaking to the homeowner, as though her word were the official report and his merely an appendix. He closed the notebook, then opened his computer and logged into the residence portal, using his tenant account. One by one, he opened the archived sections. Lawn maintenance records were there. Fence painting records were there. Even the streetlight replacements from 3 years earlier were listed with receipts for every single bulb. But when he typed the words dam inspection into the search box, the screen returned a blank line. He tried again with other terms: reservoir safety, spillway maintenance, structural survey, and every time he received the same white, empty silence. An earthen dam had stood there for nearly half a century, holding an entire lake above several dozen homes, yet in all the neighborhood's records there wasn't a single inspection report, as though some hand had quietly lifted every one of those pages out of the drawer before anyone had the chance to ask for them. Grayson leaned back in his chair and watched the cursor blink inside the empty search field, the corner of his mouth lifting into a smile that held no trace of amusement. 10 years ago, his sister had found something hidden inside pages of financial records. 10 years later, he had just found the first thing of his own in pages that had disappeared. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, a gleaming black Lincoln pulled up in front of number 12, so quietly, it was as though the car itself had been taught not to make a sound. The man who stepped out was close to 60, with neatly combed silver hair and a white pastry box tied with a ribbon in one hand. He introduced himself as Alden Croft, president of the Honeysuckle Lane Residents Association and director of the property management company responsible for the entire neighborhood, then held out the box with the smile of a man who had practiced in front of a mirror for enough years to make it look exactly like sincerity. "Peach pie," he said, "the best in Cypress Hollow," and an apology as well for the less than welcoming reception Grayson had received over the past few days. Grayson invited him to sit on the porch, made coffee, and for the next half hour he was treated to a first-class performance. Croft never asked anything directly. He told stories about the town, admired the timber framing of the house, and slipped sharpened hooks between harmless remarks, saying that restoration work must depend heavily on regular clients, and that Boston was such a long way away that choosing Cypress Hollow in particular surely meant someone had recommended the place. Grayson answered every hook with smooth courtesy that gave it nowhere to catch. His clients were collectors, he explained. They found the craftsman. The craftsman didn't need to find them. As for Cypress Hollow, he had chosen it after seeing a rental listing online because the price was reasonable. Only once during the conversation, when Grayson casually mentioned that the dam at the end of the road looked rather old and wondered whether the county sent inspectors down very often, Croft's right hand rose to his breast pocket, drew out a silver pocket watch, flipped it open, glanced at the time, then closed it with a dry, precise click. He replied that every structure in the neighborhood was maintained according to proper procedure, and Mr. Hale could simply concern himself with his wood planing. The gesture of checking the time was so unnecessary that it was no longer really about the time at all. It was a comma, a moment to recover his rhythm. And Grayson placed that detail into the notebook he carried in his mind. Before leaving, Croft stood on the porch steps, looked once along the street as the evening lights began to come on, then turned back. His voice was still sweet, but it had cooled by several degrees. "There are 2 things people in Cypress Hollow value most, Mr. Hale," he said. "Quiet, and people who know where they ought to be looking." The Lincoln rolled away as silently as it had arrived, and Grayson opened the box of peach pie, looked at the golden slices inside, then closed the lid without taking a single bite. On Saturday morning, every calculation was temporarily set aside when the car from Boston stopped at the gate and a small figure with her hair tied into 2 pigtails raced across the yard like a ray of sunlight that had learned how to run. Maggie, 6 years old, threw her arms around her father's legs, and for those 2 days of the weekend, number 12 stopped being an observation post and became only a home filled with the scent of fresh wood. As father and daughter stood together at the planing bench, his large hands wrapped around her tiny ones, pushing the plane forward to raise curls of wood like little flowers, she laughed brightly, gathering each shaving and tucking it into her hair, declaring it the crown of the workshop princess. Grayson built her a small stool and let her choose the paint herself. Maggie picked the brightest yellow she could find, brushing it on while chattering without pause, telling him that every Saturday she looked forward to story time at school, where the best storyteller in the whole world read to them. And did Daddy know? Her name was Miss Josie, and she lived right next door to him. Grayson laughed, and for the first time in days, the sound didn't have to wear a mask. Only once that Saturday morning, while father and daughter were leaving the yellow stool in the sun to dry, did Grayson notice the black Lincoln moving slowly past the end of the street and stopping across the road for about half a minute. Croft didn't get out. He didn't acknowledge anyone. He merely directed his gaze toward number 12 the way a man might glance at a piece on a game board. Then the car rolled away, but Grayson had already shifted half a step to one side, just enough for his shadow to completely cover the yellow stool and its little painter. On Sunday afternoon, he fastened his daughter's seatbelt and listened as she leaned toward the open car door and reminded him that he had to take good care of the stool until she came back to paint another coat. Then he stood in the middle of the driveway and watched the car grow smaller along the road heading north. He turned back and remained outside the workshop door for a long time, and one thing became clearer to him than ever before. His daughter's world had to remain a world of sawdust and yellow paint forever. It could never be allowed to contain the shadows of black cars stopping across the road for half a minute. He took out his phone, dialed a number saved without a name, and when the voice on the other end answered, his own voice was no longer that of the quiet, gentle woodworker. "Sawyer," he said, "bring the men and the equipment down to the warehouse in the neighboring county. Enough for every contingency. And wait for my order." The voice on the other end asked only one brief question, and Grayson looked toward the dam as it darkened beneath the fading light of sunset, then answered in the voice that had made all of Boston fall silent whenever it was heard. "No, nothing has changed. This hunt simply has to end sooner than I planned." Over the following week, Darlene Prescott called the county sheriff's office a total of 5 times, and Grayson counted every call the way a hunter counts tracks in the snow. The first time, she reported that the lumber delivery man appeared to be taking photographs of residents' homes, when in fact he was only photographing the barcode on the shipment for the delivery record. The second time, she reported a stranger carrying metal cases into number 12 at twilight. The stranger was Sawyer, bringing down several fully documented cases of woodworking tools. The third time, she reported a suspicious gathering, and that gathering turned out to be 74-year-old Pearl Ashby, coming over with a jar of fig preserves, sitting for exactly 1 hour, then leaving with the help of her cane. The fourth time, she reported a suspicious service vehicle parked near the base of the dam. It was the electric company's truck, there to replace a fuse according to a schedule that had been publicly posted. The fifth time, she reported that the man at number 12 was secretly taking measurements at sunset, and that secretive activity consisted of Grayson standing in his own yard with a moisture meter, checking a few boards that had been left out to dry. 5 calls, 5 different stories, yet the endings were astonishingly identical. A patrol car always arrived within 6 to 10 minutes. A few questions were asked, and then it left with a report stating that no violation had occurred. Grayson didn't become angry, and he didn't complain. Each night, he simply opened his leather notebook and quietly built a tracking table. The content of each call, the actual emergency level, which was 0 on all 5 lines, the patrol response time, and the outcome, no violation 5 times. Beneath that table, he added 1 line in darker ink. During that same week, a pickup truck had been broken into 3 blocks from Honeysuckle Lane and its tools stolen, and the owner had sat on the sidewalk for more than an hour before a patrol car finally appeared. A real theft had been forced to wait behind calls about an old woman's jar of fig preserves. The comparison required no commentary. The numbers themselves were an accusation. By the 5th call, when Deputy Lawson stepped out of his patrol car as darkness settled over the street, Grayson saw on the young man's face the thing he had been waiting for: exhaustion. Lawson completed the procedure quickly, and when Grayson offered him a glass of cold water and casually remarked that staffing must be thin if he kept having to run back and forth for things like this, the young deputy drank half the glass in one swallow, looked toward the house across the yard where the curtains had just closed, and let slip something that should have remained inside the department. He said he didn't want to keep coming either. But whenever a call came in from Prescott's number, the system immediately tagged it RDC, Retired Deputy Contact. The caller was a former deputy sheriff, and any call carrying that code was automatically pushed into the priority queue. The nearest patrol unit had to respond. He was only the man receiving the order. Grayson asked one more question, still using the easy tone of idle curiosity, saying that a code like that must be written somewhere in county policy. Lawson paused for half a second, the half-second of a man realizing he had said more than he was supposed to say, then answered evasively that the practice had existed since before he joined the department, and he had never seen it written in any official document. He thanked Grayson for the water, and left more quickly than usual. That night, Grayson read every publicly available policy issued by the county sheriff's office, and exactly as he expected, not a single line mentioned RDC. A priority code that didn't exist on paper, but operated smoothly in practice, meant that human hands had placed it inside the system and continued to maintain it every day. The only question left was whose hands they were and whom they served. To find the answer, Grayson did what he did best. He didn't ask. He set bait. The next morning, he prepared 3 identical notices about an appointment with a termite inspector who would be examining the wooden framing of the house the following week. The only difference between them was the appointment time. He personally handed the first notice to Darlene, and it listed 9 o'clock in the morning. The second was sent by certified mail to Croft's company office under the explanation that the property manager for the rental needed to be informed, and it listed 11 o'clock. The third was placed in the Residents Association office mailbox according to procedure, and it listed 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The actual inspector was scheduled for 11 o'clock. Then Grayson waited. When the appointment day arrived, the pest control company's vehicle turned onto Honeysuckle Lane at 5 minutes to 11, and before its engine had even been shut off, the familiar 2-tone patrol car appeared at the far end of the street, rolling slowly toward them, as though it had simply happened to be passing by at exactly the right moment. Grayson stood on the porch, looked at his watch, and felt every piece of the puzzle settle quietly into place with a crisp click like the lid of a pocket watch closing. No one had come at 9 o'clock, and no one would come at 2 in the afternoon. The police appeared around 11, the time written on only one piece of paper, the piece of paper sitting inside Alden Croft's office. The entire chain had now exposed itself. Darlene watched and lit the fuse. Croft received the information and made the decision. And at the other end, somewhere inside a county dispatch room, there had to be an operator ready to attach a priority code to selected calls, a person whose face and name Grayson didn't yet know. But he knew one thing with certainty. That person was sitting in precisely the kind of position through which, 10 years earlier, a desperate call for help on a rainy night might once have passed and never been answered. After the 3-notice trap closed, Grayson knew the other side wouldn't sit still. A man who had just realized he was being tested would have to check whatever he was hiding, the way a guilty man instinctively reaches for the pocket where he keeps his most valuable possession. So Grayson activated change tracking on the residence portal and left his computer running all night on the kitchen table. On the second night, a soft alert sounded in the darkness. Grayson walked to the screen and looked at the clock in the lower corner. 2:14 in the morning. A file had just been uploaded to the maintenance records section, titled Miller's Pond Dam Safety Inspection Report. And then, right before his eyes, it was opened, edited, and erased from the system, all in less than 8 minutes. Like an animal poking its head out of a burrow at midnight and pulling back the instant it caught an unfamiliar scent on the wind. But 8 minutes was more than enough for a man who had already been waiting. Grayson managed to save the cached copy before it disappeared, and when he opened it beneath the desk lamp, what appeared on the screen was an inspection report arranged with meticulous care down to the margins. Its conclusion printed in bold letters, stating that the dam embankment was stable, and the structure remained safe for the next 10-year inspection cycle. A beautiful document, beautiful enough to be suspicious. Grayson read it 3 times, not because he intended to believe it, but because he was looking for the places where it lied. And one by one, those places began to reveal themselves. The report was dated 6 months earlier, but the file properties showed that it had been created only 8 weeks ago. The chief engineer's signature at the bottom of the final page looked sharp at first glance, but when enlarged, its edges carried the faint, jagged blur of an image that had been cut and pasted into place. Grayson photographed every detail, called Sawyer before dawn, read him the name of the inspection company and the engineer, and instructed him to search only public business registration records and the state's professional licensing directory, because what Grayson needed was clean evidence, the kind that could be placed on a prosecutor's desk without anyone being able to question where it had come from. Around noon, Sawyer called back, his voice flat and steady as he read the results. The inspection company had been dissolved and removed from the business registry 14 months earlier, which meant that on the date printed on the report, the company no longer existed. As for the chief engineer whose signature had been pasted onto the bottom of the page, he had retired and surrendered his license even before that. The old man was now fishing in Florida, and almost certainly had no idea that his name had just been used to guarantee the safety of a dam nearly 1,000 miles away. A ghost company had signed the name of a ghost engineer to certify that a dam was safe. Grayson printed the cached copy, clipped it into the file, and realized something that sent a colder chill down his spine than the forged report itself. People only fabricated a certificate declaring something safe when they already knew that what they were talking about wasn't safe at all. But that night, the file gave him something else, something he had been searching for through 10 years without ever knowing exactly what he was looking for. While comparing the new document against everything still preserved from the flood years earlier, Grayson reopened a copy of the pumping station timesheet his attorney had obtained during the compensation proceedings, a sheet of paper he had read hundreds of times until he knew every stain by heart. Yet this time, his eyes stopped on a place they had never stopped before. The official report stated that 3 people had been at the pumping station that night, and all 3 had died: 2 technicians and the young woman who had been driving along the low road beside the lake. But the station's own timesheet, prepared at the beginning of that week, listed 4 names for that night shift. 4, not 3. The 4th name appeared on the last line: Earl Dobbins, mechanic, with a handwritten note beside it saying sick leave. Grayson lifted the paper closer to the lamp and tilted it back and forth, and the cold sensation along his spine returned for the second time that night, because the ink in those 2 words, sick leave, was darker, fresher, and noticeably bluer than the faded black ink covering the rest of the sheet, and the handwriting didn't belong to the same hand. Someone had picked up this timesheet after the night of the disaster, and, with 2 words added in the margin, erased a human being from that night as neatly as crossing out an unwanted line in a draft. Grayson went deeper into the old papers, and Earl Dobbins's name appeared exactly one more time, in the funeral guest book for one of the 2 technicians who had died, written in a trembling hand with a short message beneath it: "I'm sorry." And after that, nothing. No address, no rental record, no vehicle registration. The mechanic had left Cypress Hollow immediately after the funeral and dissolved into the vastness of the country, like a drop of water falling into sand. Grayson sat motionless before the 2 sheets of paper spread side by side, the timesheet bearing 4 names and the official report counting only 3 deaths. The empty space between those 2 numbers was a living, breathing man somewhere out there, the only person who had belonged to that rainy night and survived long enough to tell what happened. The only question, and the question that kept Grayson from closing his eyes until dawn began to pale the sky, was what kind of man had walked out of that pumping station alive: an accomplice who had been paid to clear the way for the water, or a witness who had seen something he was never meant to see and had spent the rest of his life running from it. 3 days after the night of 2:14 in the morning, an envelope bearing the seal of the Residents Association was slipped through the mail slot at number 12. Inside was a notice of violation, citing the rule against unapproved outdoor equipment and ordering him to remove the measuring devices within 7 days. Grayson read it twice, noticing that the page described the exact location of every device, including the small meter hidden behind a flower planter that could only be seen by someone standing close to the property line between the 2 houses. Then he folded the notice, clipped it into his file, and waited, because he knew this wasn't the blow itself. It was only the knock at the door. Sure enough, the following afternoon, the black Lincoln returned to number 12, but this time, Croft didn't bring the smile he had practiced in front of a mirror. He walked onto the porch with the posture of a man arriving to discuss business, placed another box of peach pie on the table as though fulfilling a formality, and went straight to the point. He said the violation notice could be taken care of if Mr. Hale showed a little goodwill and removed the measuring devices. Croft would personally recommend that the notice be withdrawn before the end of the week. And to put his mind at ease about that structure he seemed unusually interested in, Croft would arrange for a contractor familiar with Cypress Hollow to perform a complete inspection of the dam. A local man, someone who worked quickly and efficiently, without bothering the state agencies that were buried in bureaucracy and good only at producing paperwork and fees that residents eventually had to pay. Croft leaned back in his chair and waited with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had just placed an offer on the table that no reasonable person could possibly refuse. Grayson allowed the silence to stretch just long enough, then asked his first question in the mild tone of someone asking the price of a board. Which company had performed the most recent inspection of the dam? Croft blinked and replied that the records went back many years, and he couldn't possibly remember the name of every contractor. Grayson nodded as though he understood, then asked his second question. During that inspection, had a licensed engineer personally visited the site, or had the report simply been signed from somewhere else? Croft's interlaced fingers tightened slightly over his knee. He said professional procedures were the responsibility of the inspection company. He was a property manager, not an engineer. Grayson nodded again and asked his third question, more slowly than the first two. Then, as president of the association, and the person who signed acknowledgement of receipt for the inspection report, could he tell Grayson who had read and verified that report on behalf of the residents? This time, there was no answer at all. Croft's right hand rose to his breast pocket and drew out the pocket watch. He turned the silver lid between two fingers without opening it. One turn, then another, before slipping it back into place. When he stood, his voice had been smoothed flat again, though the ripple beneath it could no longer be hidden. "Mr. Hale should think carefully about the offer before those 7 days expired," Croft said. "In life, there were certain doors a man ought to walk through while they were still open." The Lincoln drove away, and on the porch table the box of peach pie remained unopened, just as the first box still sat in the corner of the kitchen, the two white boxes resting side by side like two cards that had been refused. Grayson wrote in his leather notebook that a man had just offered to trade silence for peace, and when asked 3 questions about a single piece of paper, he had been unable to answer any of them. But Croft had other ways of answering that required no words. Only a few days later, the atmosphere around Grayson began to change. The man who had waved to him every morning suddenly found reasons to stare down at his garden hose whenever Grayson passed. The elderly couple at the end of the street carried their chairs inside whenever they saw him approaching from a distance. Conversations beside the mailboxes went silent the moment he came near. That silence had been arranged by someone's hand, and Grayson knew where it was coming from, because every afternoon Darlene spent longer than usual, moving from house to house for tea. The answer finally came one afternoon when Grayson stopped at the town's only diner and sat at the counter with a sandwich, feeling eyes touch his back and quickly withdraw. A middle-aged woman left a table where she had been sitting with friends, walked past the counter, as though she were getting more napkins, and paused beside him just long enough to whisper that Prescott had been telling everyone in the neighborhood that he wasn't really a woodworker at all. The man at number 12, she said, was digging around for something that could destroy property values across all of Honeysuckle Lane, and anyone who became friendly with him would regret it before long. The woman returned to her table without waiting for his thanks, leaving Grayson in front of a meal that was slowly growing cold, and an old truth that remained remarkably effective. In a town where a house was a family's entire fortune, its retirement, and perhaps the only thing parents had to leave their children, no one needed to accuse a man of murder. All they had to do was whisper that he threatened property values, and the whole community would build a wall around him on its own. He was looking down into his coffee when a tray was set on the counter beside him, the clean sound of porcelain touching wood carrying through the diner as the room grew quiet. Josie Whitfield pulled out the stool next to his and sat down beneath the eyes of half the town. She called toward the kitchen for another slice of apple pie, then turned to Grayson and asked in a perfectly normal, clear voice, without lowering it at all, whether the yellow stool belonging to his little student had been finished yet, because the girl had told the entire class it was the most beautiful stool in the whole state of Georgia. Grayson looked at Josie for 1 second and understood completely what it was costing her to do this. He answered that it was finished, and only waiting for the chief painter to come down and approve the final coat. Josie laughed, her bright laughter ringing through the diner like a window thrown open inside a sealed room, and all around them the town quietly lowered its eyes to its plates, because some invisible walls need only one person brave enough to sit in the right place before the first hairline crack begins to appear. That night, after turning off the workshop lights and standing at the upstairs window as he always did to sweep his eyes once across the street before going to bed, Grayson saw it for the first time, a pale gray sedan parked beneath an oak tree about 7 houses down from number 12, positioned precisely in the dark gap between 2 streetlights where no ordinary driver would choose to stop. And behind the darkened windshield, the glow of a phone screen flashed once and disappeared. The next night it was there again, this time on the opposite side of the street, but it was the same car, the same shape, the same instinct for choosing shadows. And once again it was gone before dawn. Grayson didn't need a third night to know he was being watched. What he needed to know was by whom. It wasn't one of Croft's people. Croft's style was violation notices stamped in red, not men sitting in the dark watching a house. It wasn't the county police either. Grayson had memorized every patrol car license plate that moved through this part of town. That left one possibility, and it sent a chill along the back of his neck, that someone up north had caught the scent of the name Grayson Hale, that the old world was reaching one finger down into this town, where there was a dam, an unfinished investigation, and worst of all, where any weekend might bring a yellow stool and the little girl who owned it. He called Sawyer that same night, his voice short and sharp. A gray sedan has been watching this neighborhood for 3 nights. Don't touch it. Follow it backward. Find out where it eats, who the plate is registered to, and report to me before it has a chance to report back to whoever owns it. Sawyer took the order without asking another question, and Grayson ended the call, reminding himself that worry wasn't a plan. The following evening, while he was clearing the workshop porch, Josie appeared beside the low fence, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She said she owed him a thank you for the yellow stool, and if he didn't mind, the wicker chairs on the porch at number 14 were more comfortable than those sawdust-covered steps of his. Grayson accepted the tea and followed her across. They sat together amid the sound of crickets and the scent of honeysuckle, talking about one small thing after another, nothing important, until the conversation gradually softened with the darkness. Then Josie, both hands wrapped around a glass whose ice had long since melted, her eyes fixed on the black shape of the dam against the star-filled sky, began speaking in a voice that was strangely even as someone reading a page she had memorized because she had read it alone too many times. She told him she had grown up in an orphanage in the neighboring county, with no parents and no siblings, and that the first person who ever taught her what the word family meant was a kind-hearted technician who worked nights at the pumping station beneath the dam, a man who proposed to her with a ring bought on installments, and a promise that from then on, she would never again have to write none in the space marked next of kin on any form. The wedding was supposed to take place on an early autumn Sunday. The dress had already been made. 40 invitations had been sent. 3 days before the wedding, heavy rain began to fall. He still went in for his night shift and told her to go to bed early so her skin would look beautiful in the photographs. Those were the last words she ever heard from him, because sometime after midnight, water swept through the pumping station. People called it a flash flood. They called it a natural disaster. For 10 years, Josie had never been able to find any name for it at all. She told him that after the funeral, someone from the station had brought her a cardboard box containing whatever belongings of his remained at work, and she had placed the entire box on top of a cabinet, sealed it with tape, and for 10 years had never once found the courage to open it, because she was afraid that as long as the box stayed sealed, somewhere inside it there was still a part of him that hadn't truly left. When she finished, she went quiet. She didn't cry. She only turned the glass slowly between her hands and whispered that she was sorry, that she didn't know why she had told all of this to someone she had only just met. Maybe it was because he was the first person in this town who looked at that dam for as long as she always had. Grayson didn't answer. He sat motionless for a long time, and inside his pocket, his fingers had somehow closed around the small folding knife with the cherry wood handle, gripping it so tightly that the grain of the wood pressed its pattern into his palm. 10 years ago, on the same rainy night, beneath the same dam, that water had taken the fiancé of the woman sitting beside him, and it had taken his sister too. 2 names lying beside each other on the same list. A list someone had prepared before the rain ever began to fall. 2 wounds had traveled side by side for 10 years from opposite ends of the country, and tonight they sat together on the same porch, without knowing they had been cut by the same blade. He wanted to tell her. The words rose all the way to his throat, but he swallowed them, because speaking now would mean telling her everything, and telling her everything would mean pulling the woman who had just entrusted him with the most precious thing she carried into a hunt whose depths he still hadn't measured. So he managed only one sentence, his voice rougher than he intended, saying that he was grateful she had told him, and that sometimes people kept certain boxes closed not because they were weak, but because the time to open them hadn't come yet. Josie turned to look at him, as though she were about to ask why his voice had suddenly changed. but in the end she only nodded, and the two of them sat silently together in the darkness, each holding one half of the same rainy night, while farther down the street, beneath the oak tree, the gray sedan quietly returned to its place like an ash-colored question mark. The notice for the regular residents' meeting was posted on the bulletin board at the end of the street on Wednesday morning, listing 7 o'clock Friday evening at the small meeting hall beside the association office, with an agenda covering the landscaping budget, the sidewalk repair schedule, and general neighborhood matters, and it was that final phrase that gave Grayson the opening he had been waiting for. Because under the association's own rules, every registered resident, including tenants, had the right to raise concerns during the general matters portion of the meeting. On Friday evening, the hall was more crowded than usual. Darlene sat in the front row with the posture of someone guarding a courtroom. Pearl leaned on her cane at the back of the room. Josie sat near the edge of the middle section, and when Grayson walked in, the murmur of conversation dropped half a tone, before awkwardly rising again. Croft presided from the table on the platform, his smooth voice carrying everyone through the landscaping budget and sidewalk repairs, and when he asked almost as a formality whether anyone had any general concerns to raise, Grayson stood in the middle rows and said he had 3 questions, brief ones, and he hoped they could be answered right there, in front of everyone. The entire room turned toward him. His first question was this. He had submitted a private written notice about a contractor appointment to exactly 2 places, as required by procedure, yet less than 2 hours later, the contents of that notice had appeared in a police report made by someone whose name wasn't on the recipient list, and he wanted to know who had passed it along. Darlene spun around, her face flushing red, and said watching suspicious people was a citizen's right. But Grayson lifted one hand slightly and replied that he wasn't asking about anyone's right to watch. He was asking how a piece of paper had traveled from one place to another. Those were 2 different things, and his eyes settled on the man behind the table. Croft smiled and said the association had a responsibility to keep its members informed. Grayson nodded and asked whether that meant the association office had shared his private notice with a third party, and whether Croft was confirming that in front of everyone. Croft's smile seemed to freeze on his face. He said he didn't personally know the details of every piece of correspondence. The second question was this. During the 5 police reports made about lawful activities at number 12 over the previous week, every call had been assigned the RDC priority code. Bringing a patrol car to the property in less than 10 minutes, while a real burglary only 3 blocks away had waited more than an hour. Grayson had read every publicly available county policy and hadn't found that code mentioned anywhere, so on what written authority did it exist? This time, no one laughed. Several residents looked at one another. An older man in the 3rd row quietly asked his wife whether it had really taken more than an hour, because that had been the day the Tucker family's truck was broken into, and Croft had to tap the table lightly and say that police dispatch procedures were outside the authority of the Residents Association. Grayson nodded once more, then took a folded sheet of paper from his pocket, opened it slowly, and asked his 3rd question. This, he said, was a printed copy of a dam safety inspection report that had appeared on the residence portal for exactly 8 minutes, one recent night before being deleted. The report declared the dam safe, yet it bore the signature of a chief engineer who had retired before the inspection date, acting on behalf of a company that had been dissolved 14 months before that same date. So, why did such a document exist? Who uploaded it? And who deleted it at 2:14 in the morning? The room became so quiet that the clicking of the ceiling fan could be heard overhead, and in that moment, Croft showed Grayson exactly why he had survived in his position for so many years. He didn't deny anything. He didn't explain anything. He didn't touch a single word contained in any of the 3 questions. He simply removed his glasses, polished them with a handkerchief, put them back on, then addressed the room in the voice of a concerned father. He had sat in that chair for 15 years, he said, and in all that time he had never seen the neighborhood disturbed the way it had been over the past few weeks. He didn't know what Mr. Hale was looking for, but he knew one thing for certain. The moment even one complaint expressing doubt about the dam reached the state, agencies would descend on the neighborhood, measuring, excavating, shutting things down, and every dollar of the cost would eventually be divided among the homeowners. An unnecessary investigation could mean thousands of dollars in additional assessments for every household, and many people sitting in that room lived on fixed retirement incomes. So he had only one question in return. Which one of them was prepared to pay for the suspicions of a man who had lived there for only 8 weeks? The mood in the room shifted instantly. like the wind changing before a storm. Whispers about thousands of dollars moved from one row to the next, and several people began looking at Grayson very differently from the way they had 3 minutes earlier. He stood there understanding that he had just watched a master at work, a man who had answered none of the questions and still managed to turn the person asking them into the defendant. At that moment, the sharp tap of a cane struck the wooden floor from the back of the room. Pearl Ashby stood, straighter than her 74 years should have allowed, and said she had lived in that neighborhood longer than anyone else sitting there. She had attended more meetings than she could count, and every difficult question had always been answered with a number showing how much money everyone would have to pay. She only wanted to say one thing before sitting down. "Silence might keep supper peaceful," she said, while water was already seeping into the foundation. The words fell into the middle of the room like a stone dropped into a pond. Someone in the second row raised a hand as though preparing to ask another question, but Croft stood faster, gathered his stack of papers, announced that they had gone over time, said the remaining matters would be answered in writing, thanked everyone for coming, declared the meeting adjourned, and left the platform before the first chair had even scraped against the floor. When Grayson returned home that night, he found the sensor behind the flower planter completely dead. Its battery cover had been pried open, and its circuit board had been snapped cleanly by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. The porch camera had captured only a hooded figure approaching from precisely the blind angle, working for less than a minute, then backing away. No face, no gait clear enough to identify. Grayson didn't call the police just to receive another report, stating that no violation had occurred. He backed up the footage, placed the damaged sensor inside a sealed evidence bag, and that same night took out 3 remote transmitting sensors no larger than matchboxes, devices that measured and transmitted their data wirelessly on their own, with no indicator lights and no sound. He moved through the darkness along the edge of the garden and buried each one in a location that appeared on no association map and couldn't be seen from the street, because he had just learned the most important lesson of the evening. When the other side started smashing the measuring devices, it meant the devices were measuring exactly where they were supposed to. Sawyer appeared at number 12 on Tuesday afternoon in the familiar role of a materials delivery man, carrying a bundle of walnut boards into the garage and remaining there for another 10 minutes behind the half-closed door. And those 10 minutes were worth more than everything Grayson had uncovered in the previous 8 weeks. The gray sedan had a name and a history now, Sawyer said, his voice low and clipped like a man reading from an official report. 3 nights of following it backward had led to a roadside motel in the neighboring county. The car was on a long-term rental from an agency in Atlanta, and the man paying for the room with a corporate card was a risk assessment investigator employed by the insurance division of a major real estate development corporation, the kind of man paid to arrive first and inspect the property with his own eyes before his employers signed contracts worth many figures. "Not Boston," Sawyer added, and Grayson gave a slight nod, feeling the weight roll off one shoulder only to settle immediately onto the other, because the old world hadn't found him. But what kind of risk was a real estate corporation assessing in an aging residential neighborhood beneath a 50-year-old dam? The answer was inside the brown envelope Sawyer placed on the planing bench before he left. Copies of extracts from county and state-secured transaction records, filtered from thousands of archived pages by searching one specific name. That night, beneath the desk lamp in the workshop, Grayson spread the pages across the wooden surface and read them slowly, like a man probing for mines. The land beneath Miller's Pond, more than 40 acres that had lain under water for half a century, was legally controlled by the company registered to manage the neighborhood's infrastructure, and 3 years earlier, every interest attached to that land had been pledged in a quiet transaction to an intermediary entity. Following the trail backward through 2 layers of shell companies led directly to the same corporation, paying the man in the gray sedan, and in the lower corner of the filing, inside the box identifying the representative of the pledging party, was a signature Grayson had seen often enough to recognize even in darkness: the evenly slanted, meticulous, self-satisfied handwriting of Alden Croft. He sat motionless as the scattered pieces of the past 8 weeks began turning in his mind, finding one another and locking into place with a series of crisp clicks, like a mechanism opening from within. 40 acres of land were worthless only as long as they remained underwater. To sell the land, the lake had to be drained. To drain the lake, there had to be a reason no one could dispute, and there was only one reason powerful enough. The dam had to be declared so badly deteriorated that repairing it was no longer possible, forcing it to be permanently decommissioned for the safety of the residents themselves. Once that reason was placed at the center of the board, every move Croft had made revealed its true shape. He hadn't been patching the dam like some ordinary embezzler. He had been allowing it to rot slowly over the years while building a flawless wall of paperwork around it. Forged inspection reports declaring it safe so that no maintenance budget, no repair crew, and no outside agency would ever have a reason to touch the structure. While every curious eye had to be blinded with rumors, violation notices, and priority-coded police calls, because one honest, independent inspection would expose two truths at the same time, that the dam really was dangerous, and that it was dangerous because it had been deliberately starved of maintenance. He isn't hiding a failing dam. Grayson heard the thought ring through the empty workshop as clearly as if someone had spoken aloud. He's raising it to fail, slowly, methodically, with beautiful reports in the files, waiting for the day when he can point at it in front of the whole town and say that the structure has simply grown too old, and for everyone's safety, there is no choice but to drain the lake. And when the reasoning reached that point, it didn't stop. It rushed backward 10 years, and Grayson had to brace one hand against the edge of the planing bench. Fiona. His sister had been an accountant for this very company, and for 10 years he had believed she died because she discovered that maintenance funds were being siphoned away, a dirty but ordinary embezzlement scheme. Tonight he understood that he had underestimated both his enemy and his sister. No one built a scheme involving 40 acres of submerged land overnight, and a sharp young accountant tracing money diverted away from the dam far enough would eventually see not only where the money had gone, but the shape of the thing being cultivated beneath the lake. Fiona hadn't died because she caught a thief reaching into a safe. She died because she had reached the edge of this game and seen the entire board, 3 days before she could tell anyone else. Grayson lowered himself onto the small stool beside the planing bench, the darkness broken only by the yellow pool of lamplight falling across the papers. This time, his hand didn't turn the folding knife as it usually did. It simply rested still over the pocket that held it, because there are moments when stillness weighs more than any movement. For 10 years, he had been sharpening a blade without knowing exactly where it would have to cut. And tonight, the shadow he had been chasing had finally agreed to stand still, taking the full shape of a man with evenly slanted handwriting, a silver pocket watch, 15 years in the president's chair, and 40 acres of land waiting beneath the water. For the first time since the night he was told his sister was dead, Grayson Hale's plan to seek justice through the law was no longer an abstract promise. It had a full name now, and what remained for him to do, the hardest part of all, was to turn everything he could see tonight into something 12 strangers sitting on a jury would be forced to see exactly the same way. After the night in the workshop, Grayson changed the way he played the game. For the past 8 weeks, he had been setting traps to discover which hands the thread passed through. Now he knew every one of those hands, so the next trap wasn't designed to investigate anymore. It was designed to corner, because a man patient enough to let a dam rot for years would never willingly expose himself to the light unless someone lit a fire beside the one thing he absolutely had to save. And Grayson knew exactly where that thing was. A man careful enough to forge the signature of a retired engineer would never leave traces of the night of the crime anywhere public, unless those traces were hidden in a place he believed no one else would ever be allowed to enter. And the only place that fit that description was the outlet valve house at the foot of the dam, the low brick structure with a steel door that was always locked, its key controlled by Croft's company. On Thursday afternoon, Grayson staged the simplest performance of his life. He walked into the front yard and stopped beside the fence just as Darlene was watering her chrysanthemums. He took out his phone and spoke to Sawyer at the volume of a man who thought his neighbor couldn't hear him, though in reality he had already measured the distance with his eyes. "Yes," he said, "the state has received the complaint. The independent inspection team will be here this week. What they want to examine most carefully is the valve house at the foot of the dam. Once they open that door, they'll know exactly how this dam has been cared for over the past 10 years. He ended the call, nodded politely to Darlene as though nothing had happened, and went back inside. On the other side of the fence, the sound of running water stopped earlier than usual, and through a narrow gap in the curtains, Grayson saw his neighbor abandon the chrysanthemums and hurry indoors with her phone already pressed to her ear. The rest was simply a matter of waiting. 2 hidden cameras had been in position for 3 nights already, one covering the footpath leading down to the base of the dam, the other disguised inside a vine-covered hollow in the rocks directly opposite the steel door. Grayson sat in front of the screens for 2 straight nights, patient as a night fisherman who knew with certainty there was something beneath the water. On the second night, at 11:18, The fish took the bait. There were no headlights, no flashlight cutting across the path, only a figure separating itself from the trees and moving beneath the weak light of a young moon. But there was no mistaking the walk, the straight back, the even steps of someone who had traveled that path often enough that he no longer needed to look at the ground. Alden Croft, wearing a dark coat, stopped at the steel door, inserted a key, and disappeared inside. The camera couldn't see into the valve house, but through the narrow opening of the door, Grayson could see the beam of a small flashlight moving within, slowly and methodically, lingering for a long time at one point along the left wall. Then the light went out, the door opened, and Croft stepped outside with one hand slipping something into the inside pocket of his coat, a small, flat object that Grayson recognized when he enlarged the footage frame by frame. It was an old inspection tag with a hole for a wire, the kind of metal tag attached to a valve after every operation, to record the date, time, and name of the person who performed it, a fragment of history in aluminum that had hung there for 10 years. And tonight the hand from that long-ago night had returned to erase itself. Croft locked the door, turned to leave, and then stopped. In the darkness, his silver-haired head slowly turned toward the vine-covered hollow in the rocks, with such precision that it was as though someone had taken him by the hand and pointed out the exact direction. On Grayson's screen, Alden Croft's face gradually came into clear view as he took 2 steps closer, bent down until his eyes were level with the lens, and looked directly into it. He stared for a long time. He didn't panic. He didn't cover his face. He didn't tear the camera away. He only looked, and then the corner of his mouth rose into a smile without even 1,000th of fear in it. He straightened, adjusted the collar of his coat, and walked away at an easy pace like a man who had just finished a pleasant stroll around the lake. Grayson replayed the footage 3 times, and the 3rd time he watched only for that smile, because he had spent half his life among men caught in the act, and knew every version of the face a man wore in that moment, but the face on the screen belonged to none of them. It wasn't the smile of a fish that had seen the hook. It was the smile of one fisherman who had spotted another fisherman's line, an unauthorized hidden camera aimed at public infrastructure, installed at night by a man renting a house and pretending to be a woodworker. Croft had understood all of that within seconds, and instead of destroying the camera, he had left it untouched, as though leaving behind a calling card. "I have seen you, and I know you don't dare show anyone what you just recorded." The familiar cold sensation crawled along Grayson's spine, but this time it wasn't because of what he had discovered. It was because something had just discovered him. He copied the footage onto 2 hard drives, locked them in the safe, and at that exact moment, his phone lit up. It was an email from the independent hydraulic engineer, with a subject line containing only 4 words, "Urgent preliminary safety warning," and the message itself was brutally brief. The foundation moisture readings from the past week showed that seepage through the dam was advancing significantly faster than any initial model had predicted. He needed another 3 days of data to quantify the progression accurately, but professionally, he was obligated to say one thing in advance. This dam was growing weaker by the week, not by the year. Grayson read the email twice, then raised his eyes and looked through the workshop window toward the enormous black mass lying motionless beneath the young moon like a sleeping beast. And for the first time since arriving in Cypress Hollow, he understood that his chessboard had just gained a 3rd player, one that needed no evidence, feared no rumor, took orders from no one, and was making moves of its own with every drop of water seeping through the earth each night. 2 nights after the night at the valve house, Croft made his move, and Grayson had to admit that it was ruthlessly elegant. On Monday morning, Deputy Lawson stood on the porch of number 12, holding a document bearing the seal of the county sheriff's office, speaking in the strained voice of a man carrying out an order he didn't entirely believe in, and informed Grayson that the Residents Association security cameras had recorded a man unlawfully approaching the valve house area the other night. The footage had been extracted by President Croft and submitted with the report. The man in the video wore a dark canvas jacket, was tall and broad-built, carried an equipment bag across his shoulder, and his face wasn't clear because of the distant camera angle, but every detail matched only one resident in the neighborhood. Grayson stood still and listened to the end, and the shape of the game appeared in his mind, with a clarity cold enough to make him shiver. Croft hadn't gone home to sleep that night. He had immediately staged a mirror image performance. One of his men had put on a jacket like Grayson's, carried a bag like Grayson's, and walked slowly enough through the exact field of view of the community camera whose every angle Croft knew by heart. And just like that, on paper, the man lurking around the valve house wasn't Alden Croft with a ring of keys in his hand. It was the shadow of Grayson Hale. Lawson continued, almost apologetically, saying that the office had issued an order prohibiting all unauthorized individuals from approaching the dam protection corridor within 50 meters. The order applied to every resident, but everyone understood it had been written for one man. Grayson accepted the notice and asked only one question. Did the footage show the man actually entering the valve house? Lawson said it only showed him outside. There was no indication that the door had been opened. Grayson nodded and said that was good, because if someone really had managed to get inside, the thing they ought to be worried about was what might have disappeared from that valve house. The remark made the young deputy look at him for another 2 seconds before leaving. 2 seconds in which a seed had been planted. But seeds needed time, and rumors didn't. Within 48 hours, Croft's version of events had made a complete circuit of the town, and Darlene moved through the wave as though it were a festival arranged in her honor. The wall around number 12, after showing one thin crack at the diner days earlier, was rebuilt 3 times thicker. At night, Grayson sat in the workshop before 2 screens. On one was the figure wearing a jacket like his in the fabricated footage the entire town now believed. On the other was the sharp, genuine recording of Croft inserting his key, the aluminum tag disappearing into his coat pocket, and that smile aimed directly into the lens. Grayson had turned over every possible path for bringing that truth into the light, only to find that every one of them ended at the same cliff. Handing the footage to the police meant explaining who he was and why he possessed specialized hidden cameras aimed at public infrastructure. And every honest answer would lead to 10 more questions. About Boston, about Sawyer, about the name Hale, a name that any diligent officer could type into a federal system and burn his entire cover to the ground within an hour. Every piece of evidence against Croft would be stained as the revenge of a crime boss. And worst of all, the investigative file would contain the name Maggie Hale, 6 years old, Boston. Croft didn't need to know exactly who Grayson was. He only needed to be certain of one thing. A man who installed hidden cameras was a man who had something of his own to hide. Croft had wagered the entire move on the judgment that his opponent's secret was larger than his, and he had won. That was the full meaning of the smile that night. Grayson turned off the screens and sat in the darkness, his own hands bound by the very rope he had brought with him, while the engineer's email still glowed in his inbox like a countdown clock. The dam was weakening by the week, not by the year. Then the video call rang. The screen lit up with the contact name saved beside a golden heart, and within a single breath Grayson straightened, switched on the desk lamp, and adjusted his collar. Maggie pressed her face so close to the camera that at first he could see only one enormous round eye. Then she leaned back with a wide grin and proudly showed him the brand new gap in her front teeth. Her first loose tooth had fallen out that afternoon, and Daddy, her teacher, said losing a tooth meant she was really growing up now, so next week when she came down, he had to take a picture of her sitting on the yellow stool as proof for all her friends. She chattered about school, about the neighbor's cat that had just given birth to 4 kittens, and not the faintest ripple from the adult world could touch that bright, tumbling stream of words. Grayson smiled throughout the call, truly smiled, until the tiny hand waved goodbye and the screen went dark, leaving the man sitting alone in the shadowed workshop. And in that moment, Grayson Hale understood more clearly than ever the position he was standing in. Croft had managed to bind his hands because Grayson had something to lose, but that very thing he had to lose was also the only reason he absolutely wasn't allowed to lose. In the middle of the fever of rumors sweeping across Honeysuckle Lane, there was one person who didn't believe a single second of it, and she had a reason measured down to the hour. Josie Whitfield suffered from insomnia. That was nothing new. For 10 years, her sleep had been full of holes like an old net, and on the nights when sleep wouldn't come, she often brewed chamomile tea and sat outside in the wicker chair on her porch. The night the Residents Association footage was recorded had been one of those nights. She had sat outside from a little after 11 o'clock until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, and throughout that entire stretch of time, she remembered clearly that the workshop light at number 12 had remained on, a warm yellow glow spilling through the thin curtain, and against that curtain, from time to time, the shadow of a tall man moved across the fabric. The familiar shadow she had caught herself watching on more than one night before silently scolding herself for looking at all. A person couldn't cast his shadow against the curtain of his own workshop and at the same time be wandering around the foot of a dam nearly a mile away during the very same hours. It was as simple as addition taught to first graders, yet the entire town was choosing to believe the wrong answer. The next morning, Josie went straight to the sheriff's office and asked to speak with Deputy Lawson, then told him exactly what she had seen. Lawson listened carefully and took notes, but eventually he lowered his pen and spoke honestly in the voice of a man bound by procedure. A single statement from a witness known to be friendly with the person under suspicion would be difficult to place against video evidence. To overturn a recording, they needed something harder than memory. A document, a piece of mechanical data. Josie left with the helpless feeling of a decent person standing before a machine that would accept nothing except paper. And throughout that day's lessons, Lawson's words kept repeating inside her head, something harder than memory, until, while she was rearranging the bookshelf at the back of the classroom, a thought passed through her so suddenly that both hands stopped in midair. She knew a place where something like that might exist, the place she had avoided for 10 years, the cardboard box sealed with tape on top of her wardrobe, everything that had remained from the workplace of a man who had once known that dam down to every pipe running through it. That afternoon, she went home early and stood in the middle of her bedroom, staring at the top of the wardrobe for a very long time. Then she brought over a stool, rose onto her toes, and for the first time in 10 years, both of her hands touched the layer of dust covering the lid of the box. The box was lighter than she remembered, or perhaps the fear had simply grown many times heavier than the box itself. She set it down in the middle of the floor and sat cross-legged before it, as though sitting across from a person, then peeled away the tape that had grown brittle with age. His gray uniform jacket lay folded neatly on top. She lifted it, and the scent of old fabric rose around her. For a while, she sat motionless with the jacket resting in her lap. She didn't cry. She only began breathing more slowly, then placed it carefully to one side, as though laying down someone who was sleeping. Beneath it were a pair of work gloves, a flashlight, a small tin box of screws, a laminated photograph of the two of them at the county fair. She touched each object exactly once, like taking attendance, like saying hello, until at the very bottom of the box, beneath a machine-cleaning cloth, she found a dark blue hardbound notebook with curled corners and water stains. Her heart missed a beat, because she recognized it immediately. It was the shift notebook he had always tucked into the breast pocket of his jacket whenever he went to work, the notebook that should have remained at the pumping station but had somehow returned with his belongings and slept at the bottom of that box for 10 years. Josie opened it with fingers that were no longer steady, turning through the first pages filled densely with the handwriting she knew so well, then moving faster toward the end where the blank pages began, until she stopped cold at the page containing the final entry. The writing there no longer had the calm, measured quality of the earlier pages. It had been written in haste, leaning sharply across the paper, and in several places the marks were pressed deep as though the writer had driven the pen down while racing against time. Columns of pressure readings were written beside times, and the numbers rose from line to line, in a pattern even an elementary school teacher could recognize as increasing. Beside them were words underlined twice, far beyond permitted levels, reported it. No one came down, and on the final line, the last words that man had ever written in his life, must open East Branch auxiliary outlet valve to reduce pressure. Old valve not shown on new map. Only Earl and I know where it is. Auxiliary outlet valve. Josie had never heard that phrase in any account of what happened over the past 10 years. She didn't know the name Earl either, but the instinct of someone who had lived for a decade with a question that had no name told her those hurried lines carried more weight than everything the town had ever been told about that night. She gently turned the page, and from between the final two sheets, a separate piece of paper folded into quarters slipped free and fell to the floor. Its edges had yellowed with age, and it wasn't paper from the notebook. She had just picked it up, her fingers beginning to trace the first fold, when a knock sounded at the front door. 3 quick knocks, not the rhythm of someone stopping by for a friendly visit. Josie startled, and almost by the instinct of a bird that had once been struck by an arrow, she folded the paper back along its old creases, slipped it between the last 2 pages of the notebook, shoved the notebook into the cloth bag hanging behind the bedroom door, then went to answer the front door. She greeted the neighbor who had come to borrow a baking pan with the most ordinary smile she could manage, saw the visitor off, closed the door, and leaned her back against it with her heart pounding like a school drum. Outside, darkness had already fallen, and the first drops of rain began tapping against the porch roof, sparse at first, then faster. Josie looked through the window toward the warm yellow light glowing from number 12 beyond the thin curtain of rain. tightened her hand around the strap of the cloth bag, and opened the door to step outside, because there are some things that can't wait until morning, and some notebooks that have waited exactly 10 years, only to be placed in the hands of the right person. While Josie crossed the rain-soaked yard with the cloth bag held tightly against her chest, Deputy Reed Lawson was also losing sleep over the Residents Association footage in the town office. He stayed after his shift, comparing the video Croft had submitted with the technical logs from the camera system, and the more he compared them, the deeper the line between his eyebrows became. The timestamp on the footage showed one particular night, but the system log showed that the original file had been copied from the recorder before the night it was supposedly filmed. A person couldn't extract footage before that footage existed, unless it had been prepared in advance and only later given a timestamp that matched the story. Miss Whitfield's statement about the workshop light was no longer a single stone standing alone. Lawson hadn't reported anything yet. He needed one day to request authorization for a deeper technical comparison, and what he didn't know was that one day was enough for the other side to move 2 steps ahead, because his extraction request had to pass through the Residents Association office, and the very afternoon that request landed on the desk, Croft understood that his bridge was about to collapse. He didn't try to repair it. He set a larger fire so no one would keep looking toward the bridge, and that fire had already been printed, stacked into piles, waiting for the right moment. That evening, as rain began falling over Honeysuckle Lane, full-color flyers were delivered to every front door and slipped into every mailbox, while at the same time, a post appeared in the online residence group with a title consisting of a single line, "Do you know who is living among us?" Beneath it was a photograph of Grayson Hale in Boston, stepping out of a black car and standing among men in suits at a funeral, along with copies of old newspaper articles bearing chilling headlines about the Hale Empire. Not one of those articles had ever convicted him of anything, but a fire didn't need a verdict. It only needed smoke, and the true purpose of those pages wasn't to expose a man. It was to silence a warning. From that night forward, every sound coming from number 12 would be heard only as the voice of a criminal. Josie knew nothing about the flyers when she reached the walkway leading to number 12, the porch light already close enough to touch, when a figure separated itself from the darkness beside the fence. Darlene stood there with her raincoat hood pulled over her head. She didn't say hello. She thrust a folded sheet of paper that still smelled of fresh ink into the hand Josie had wrapped around the cloth bag, and said in a voice that was both triumphant and urgent, "Read that before you knock on that door, teacher," then walked straight away. Josie opened the paper beneath the rain-blurred glow of the streetlight and read it. Every line, every photograph. The man in the pictures wore an expensive black coat. It was the same face she had seen turned sideways beside the planing bench, the same face she had seen break into laughter with his little daughter, the same face she had watched go silent in the darkness of her porch on the night she had opened her heart and told him everything. Now that same face stood among men whose eyes looked like knives. Rain ran down the page and smeared the ink at one corner, and inside her mind, every piece she knew about her neighbor changed color all at once. The crates secured with 2 locks, his unnatural calm through every police call. The night his voice had suddenly grown rough when she told him about the pumping station. She had thought it was empathy. Now she didn't know what it had been, and that uncertainty hurt more than anything written on the page, because she had entrusted the story of 10 years of her life to a man whose very profession wasn't real. Somehow her feet had already carried her onto the first porch step. Only 3 more steps and 1 knock remained, but her hand wouldn't rise. After a long silence filled only by rain, Josie Whitfield bent down, placed the cloth bag carefully in the driest sheltered spot beneath the porch roof, turned, and walked away without knocking, without saying a word. The door of number 12 opened only a few moments later. Grayson stood on the porch, looked down at the cloth bag damp along its edges, then looked up in time to see the woman's figure disappearing into the gray curtain of rain, and the way she walked told him everything she hadn't turned back to say. He didn't call after her. He simply stood there for a long time, rain striking the legs of his pants. And in that moment, the man who had once made all of Boston fall silent was only a neighbor left standing on his own front steps in a town that had just locked every door against him, because his enemy had taken away the final weapon Grayson hadn't even realized he possessed, the trust of a decent person. He bent down and picked up the cloth bag, but before he could open it, a sound rose from the direction of Darlene's house through the rain and made him freeze. Bruno was howling. It wasn't the old dog's usual warning bark. It was a howl, long and low, dragging through the rain before rising again, the ancient sound dogs reserved for things human beings haven't yet seen. The old mastiff lifted his muzzle toward the enormous black shape at the end of the road and kept howling, as though he were the only creature in the entire town who knew that the countdown had just begun. The rain didn't stop that night, or throughout the following day. The heavy late-season Georgia rain falling in thick sheets, and Bruno's howling didn't stop either. The old mastiff refused food, scratched at the door, paced back and forth through the house like an animal trapped in a burning cage, and by evening, he couldn't bear it any longer. When Darlene opened the back door, he slipped past her legs and charged into the rain, and for the first time in the 12 years she had owned him, she watched her dog ignore a command. He wasn't running aimlessly. He was running toward something. He crossed the waterlogged grass toward the foot of the dam, stopped at the exact strip of faded grass he had been scratching at for weeks, stood there howling in the rain, turned his head to look back at her, then howled again, until the 63-year-old woman had no choice but to pull on a raincoat, take a flashlight, and wade after her dog. And there, beneath the rain-blurred beam of the flashlight, Darlene Prescott saw something none of her roomers had ever mentioned. A fresh crack split open at the base of the downstream slope, longer than the span of her arms, and from deep inside it, water was seeping out. Not clear rainwater, but muddy water, the color of earth, pushing through slowly and steadily, as though the dam were bleeding from within. She froze. 30 years in law enforcement had taught her one thing down to the bone. People lied, paperwork lied, rumors lied, but a scene never lied. And this scene was telling her a truth that made her knees threaten to buckle. That for all these weeks her dog had been right, and she had been wrong. And if she had been wrong about the dam, then what else had she been wrong about? At that same moment, inside the workshop at number 12, the 3 sensors buried around Grayson's yard were taking turns screaming across his monitor, the soil moisture graphs suddenly rising like sheer cliffs, and the latest message from the independent engineer contained only 3 lines. Readings exceed model thresholds. Seepage has progressed to internal erosion. With the current rainfall, I can't guarantee more than 48 hours. Notify authorities immediately. Grayson read it, looked at the exclusion order lying on the table, and understood that the time for weighing options was over. He picked up the phone, dialed 911, and when dispatch answered, he spoke in the slow, clear, structured voice of a man who knew he would get only one chance. He gave his name and address, reported that seepage through the Miller's Pond Dam had progressed into internal erosion, cited the sensor data, cited the written warning from a licensed engineer, described the crack-leaking muddy water, and requested immediate emergency response. When he finished, the person on the other end remained silent for 2 seconds. Then an older male voice spoke, not asking about the crack, not asking about the measurements, but asking only one question. Let me confirm. Is this the address involved in the ongoing dispute with Mrs. Prescott next door? In that instant, Grayson knew exactly who he was speaking to. Not merely a dispatcher, but the final link in the chain. Dale Whitaker, Aldencroft's poker friend, the man who had been attaching priority codes to meaningless calls for 2 months, and was now performing the other half of the same job. Grayson replied that the question was irrelevant, that this was a report of a potential dam failure supported by technical data, and the voice on the other end answered evenly, "Thank you. The information has been recorded and will be forwarded to the appropriate department according to procedure," then disconnected. 10 minutes later, Grayson checked the call status on the county's public portal and saw it sitting there, classified under a line that turned his blood cold. Neighbor dispute at address with multiple prior complaints, low priority, no unit dispatched. And he finally understood the last layer of the game. For 2 months, all those meaningless calls targeting number 12 hadn't merely been harassment. They had poisoned the address inside the system, so that on the one night when Grayson most needed that system to listen, every word coming from this house had already been made deaf before he ever spoke. At the same hour, an email from the Homeowners Association office was sent to every household, written in language smooth as velvet, explaining that standing water around the base of the dam was normal during the rainy season, that residents shouldn't panic over rumors from unreliable sources, and Darlene received a phone call asking her to walk around the neighborhood and reassure everyone that there was no evacuation order. She agreed almost by reflex, pulled on her raincoat, visited 3 houses, repeated the sentence she had been asked to repeat 3 times, but when she reached the 4th house, she stopped in the middle of the walkway and stood motionless in the rain, because what she saw before her was no longer her neighbor's front door. She saw the crack leaking muddy water. She saw Bruno soaked to the skin. She felt 30 years of professional instinct screaming inside her chest that the scene didn't lie. And mixed through all of it, an image she had buried 10 years earlier rose to the surface. Her late husband, the county sheriff, sitting at the kitchen table the night after the disaster, signing a thick file with exhaustion on his face, saying that if the technical report concluded it was a natural disaster, then they would close the case. She had believed it. The whole county had believed it. But where had that report come from? Who had prepared it for him to sign? And for the first time in 10 years, the widow stood in the rain and asked the question she had never dared place beside her husband's name. "What did you sign that day?" Her phone rang. It was Deputy Lawson, his voice pulled tight as wire. He had just seen a call reporting a possible dam failure from number 12 downgraded in the system, and he asked her to answer one question as someone with 30 years of law enforcement experience, not as a neighbor. Had she personally seen anything abnormal at the dam? Darlene Prescott closed her eyes for 1 second, then did the one thing she had never imagined herself doing in her entire life. She confirmed the word of the man she had spent 2 months reporting. "Reed, listen to me. I just came back from the foot of the dam. There's a new crack longer than an arm span on the downstream slope. The water coming out is the color of earth. It isn't rainwater. I've been doing this long enough to know what I'm looking at. Don't trust the classification in the system. Send people down here now." And inside the workshop at number 12, Grayson Hale reached the decision of his life. He dropped to one knee before the steel safe hidden behind the lumber rack, turned the combination, and opened the heavy door. There was no money inside, no weapons, only files and a black phone that hadn't been switched on once since the day he arrived in Cypress Hollow, because turning it on meant the carpenter named Grayson died and another man came back to life. He picked it up and pressed the power button. The screen glowed blue in the darkness. He dialed the only number stored inside. The other end answered after the first ring, and Grayson Hale spoke 5 words in a voice no one in this town had heard in 10 years. "This is Hale. Activate all." 20 minutes after the 5-word call, Honeysuckle Lane witnessed something it had never seen in its entire history. A convoy of trucks turned one after another onto the narrow street beneath the pouring rain, their yellow headlights cutting through the curtain of water. No sirens, no engines roaring. They split formation at the entrance to the street, as though they had rehearsed the maneuver 100 times. Trucks carrying industrial lighting rigs stopped on the high ground. Pump trucks backed into position downstream. Vehicles loaded with barricades and sandbags spread out along the low road beside the lake. From the backs of the trucks, men wearing unmarked reflective jackets stepped down and moved in teams of 3, communicating with hand signals. Not a single shouted order, not one unnecessary step, the kind of discipline that didn't come from rescue companies but from another world, one where silence and precision were conditions of survival. Standing beneath the harsh glow of the first lighting rig, no longer dressed like a carpenter, Grayson Hale directed everything with nothing more than nods and short instructions over the radio. At the same moment, 2 counties away, Sawyer Boone sat in his vehicle outside the regional office of the Georgia State Dam Safety Agency and submitted the entire case file through the emergency intake portal. The independent engineer's report, the complete sensor data series, photographs of the crack marked with coordinates, everything arranged in exactly the sequence needed for a reviewer to make a decision in 10 minutes instead of 10 days. And the state system, a system that knew no one in Cypress Hollow, played poker with no one, and owed no one 30 years of favors, did exactly what it was supposed to do. 18 minutes later, an emergency structural condition order, accompanied by a mandatory downstream evacuation directive, was issued at the state level and pushed directly into every county coordination channel under an authentication code that couldn't be downgraded and couldn't be reclassified. In the dispatch room, Dale Whitaker sat staring at the red order moving across his screen, staring at the same address he had labeled a neighbor dispute 3 hours earlier, now appearing beneath the heading of a state evacuation order, and for the first time in his career as a gatekeeper, there was no gate left for him to guard. Sheriff Paula Hendricks received the authenticated order while working the night shift and redirected every available unit toward Honeysuckle Lane. When her command vehicle turned onto the street, flooded with artificial light, the first person she encountered was Darlene, soaked through beside the crack with Deputy Lawson. Hendricks walked toward her, and in front of her own deputies, she said something she had never once had to say to this woman in all her years of service. "Mrs. Prescott, I need your field statement as a professional witness, in no other capacity. Those 2 words, Mrs. Prescott, not Chief as she had been called for 20 years, fell between the sounds of rain, and the 63-year-old woman went silent for a beat, the silence of someone who understood that the old badge on her shoulder had just finally been removed. Then she nodded and began describing the scene with the clarity of a woman for whom 30 years had suddenly vanished. The evacuation proceeded without sirens. That was the first request Grayson passed to Hendricks through Lawson. Nothing was to create panic. And on the most dangerous night in the little town's history, it was saved by the very small things it had always underestimated. Pearl Ashby sat at the gathering point on the church hill with her yellowed handwritten directory, the one recorded in the careful handwriting of a nurse, noting which homes had elderly residents confined to bed and which residents needed heart medication in the morning. She called each name as though taking attendance over an entire lifetime. Josie Whitfield, who less than a day earlier had left her heart on the doorstep of number 12, was there from the first minutes. No one had called her. She came on her own and sat beside Pearl with a phone in her hand, dialing one number after another from the directory, her teacher's voice calm and warm as she told each family that this wasn't a drill, but it also wasn't a time to panic. Bring your medications and important papers. Turn off the gas. Don't start your car near the foot of the dam. Head toward the church hill. Someone will be there to meet you. She made call after call, leaving her broken heart somewhere behind her, because tonight the town needed her whole. And at the houses where people had read the flyers and decided they would never believe anything coming from number 12, the person knocking on their doors was Darlene Prescott, bareheaded beneath the rain, using the same 30 years of credibility she had once used to build a wall around an innocent man. It's me. Listen to me. I was wrong about that man, but I'm not wrong about the crack I just saw with my own eyes. If my word has meant anything to you in all the years you've known me, then use it tonight. Come with me. And one after another, even the most suspicious doors on Honeysuckle Lane opened before her, as though fate itself had arranged for her to repay the debt using the exact currency she had borrowed. The lake level kept rising by the hour and had already climbed close to the spillway edge. Even with the downstream pumps running at full capacity, they were only buying time. The only way out was to lower the water level before the internal erosion hollowed out the base of the dam. So when the state engineering team arrived with the independent engineer who had been summoned under emergency authority, everyone converged on the valve house. The steel door was opened under compulsory order. Floodlights illuminated the interior of the low brick building, and there, in front of the cluster of red-painted valves with their finish peeling away, the technical team stopped. The engineer held the current diagram supplied by the Homeowners Association office, compared it with the actual installation, then compared it again. When he turned around, his face told everyone the answer before he spoke. The diagram didn't match. The valve labels on paper didn't correspond to the valve positions in the floor. 2 branches had been reversed. The operating sequence had been written backward. Someone had switched the entire labeling system long ago, carefully and deliberately. And while the water outside was counting down the hours, that truth meant only one thing. Turning the wrong valve tonight wouldn't merely cause a delay. It could become the hand that helped the dam fail faster. The engineer lowered the diagram, looked at the silent cluster of valves beneath the floodlights, and no one inside the valve house dared touch anything anymore. News of the switch diagram traveled from the valve house to the evacuation point within minutes. And beneath the church porch among the gathered residents, one person suddenly felt her heart tighten as a sentence came back to her. The old valve isn't on the new map. Josie Whitfield shot to her feet, because in a single instant she understood that the thing the entire state engineering team was helplessly searching for was the very thing that had spent 10 years at the bottom of a cardboard box. She ran, without even taking time to put on a raincoat, back to number 14, and grabbed the cloth bag she had gone back to retrieve from the porch steps of number 12 on the very night she walked away. Because whatever her heart had told her then about the man behind that door, it still hadn't allowed her to leave the final handwriting of the man she loved outside in the rain. Now she held the notebook against herself, and ran back toward the foot of the dam, slipped past the barricade, past the men in reflective jackets who tried to stop her, repeating only one sentence, "Let me see the engineer. I have a map of this dam," until Grayson saw her from the center of the floodlit work area, and with a single nod from him, every arm blocking her path lowered. She placed the blue-bound notebook in the engineer's hands, opened it to the final page, and said between broken breaths that the man who wrote those words had been the pumping station technician on duty 10 years earlier, and he had known this dam better than any piece of paper they were holding. The engineer read the pressure readings climbing hour by hour. The note saying reported it, no one came down, and the final line, must open auxiliary discharge valve on east branch to reduce pressure. Old valve isn't on new map, accompanied in the margin by a series of location markings and valve codes, written according to the structure's original numbering system. He looked up and said that if this valve truly existed, it was the answer, an independent discharge route, completely separate from the mislabeled valve cluster. But the eastern branch ran for hundreds of meters, and if they had to dig for it in the rain at night, they might not find it before morning. And at that exact moment, a deep bark sounded from the barricade. Bruno, having slipped free from the person holding him at the evacuation point, soaked as though he had just been pulled from the lake, charged through the pool of floodlight toward the strip of faded grass he had been scratching at for weeks, then ran another few dozen steps eastward, along the base of the downstream slope. He stopped abruptly, turned his head toward the people behind him, and began digging at the ground with both front paws. The engineer looked at the dog, looked at the markings in the notebook, compared them with an original construction drawing that had just been recovered from the old archives, and exclaimed that it matched. The place where the dog was standing matched the notes, line for line. Shovels were brought in, 10 years of accumulated soil were stripped away, and beneath the industrial lights, a rusted circular steel cover emerged along with a buried valve stem that someone had deliberately covered over instead of properly sealing. The engineer climbed into the hole himself, compared the code engraved on the valve body with the code in the notebook, and found that every character matched. He ordered a controlled opening, 1 quarter turn, stop, measure, another quarter turn, continuing that way until the first surge of water exploded from the downstream outlet and thundered into the drainage channel, white under the lights. On the monitoring screen, the pressure reading inside the dam stopped rising. It held motionless for a long stretch, as though holding its breath, then began to fall, 1 mark at a time, back toward the safe range. The lake level dropped handspan by handspan through the night, and restrained cheers broke out around the lighting rigs from people who had just stepped back from the edge of disaster. In the middle of it all, Josie stood at the edge of the light with the notebook back in her hands, and suddenly remembered the folded piece of paper she had never finished reading. She opened it beneath the industrial lights. The rain had faded into a mist, and the handwriting on the paper wasn't that of the man she had loved. It was crooked and hurried, written by a trembling hand. Croft called and told me to leave early. Act natural. Don't trust the pressure report from this afternoon. The numbers aren't right. I checked them. Call me as soon as your shift ends. Earl. Josie read it, and 10 years of nameless questions suddenly acquired every name they had been missing within those few lines. Someone had removed 1 man from the pumping station just before the disaster. The man who remained had been warned not to trust the report, and the call he was supposed to make after his shift never came, because that shift had never ended. Josie pressed the paper against her chest and looked up at the dam, being saved by the very handwriting of the man who had died beneath it. And for the first time in 10 years, her tears fell not because she had lost him, but because at last he had been heard. At that same moment, across town, Alden Croft, disheveled for the first time in 15 years, was feeding file after file into a paper shredder running at full capacity inside the Homeowners Association office. But the frantic grinding of the machine drowned out the approaching footsteps. And when the room lights came on, Sheriff Paula Hendrick stood in the doorway with 2 deputies and an emergency order sealing every Homeowners Association record, signed by the county prosecutor at the request of the state. Croft sprang to his feet, and in the final moment of the game, the man of paperwork fought back in the only way he knew how, not with fists, not by running, but by talking rapidly about jurisdiction, lawyers, and his connections throughout the county, while both hands still tried to force the last stack of papers into the shredder blades. Hendrick stepped forward, yanked the shredder's power cord from the wall, placed the order on the desk directly in front of him, and said simply that from this second onward, Mr. Croft, every piece of paper in this room belonged to the state of Georgia, including the strips in that bin, and yes, they could put those back together too. Alden Croft looked at the order, looked at the dead shredder, looked at the half-shredded strips of paper accusing him precisely because they had been interrupted, and then his whole body seemed to deflate. He released the stack of documents, sank back into his chair, took the silver pocket watch from his coat, didn't open it, only gripped it tightly in his palm, like a drowning man clutching a scrap of wood. he had lost completely. He had lost by paperwork, the very weapon he had used his entire life, and not a single drop of blood had needed to be spilled. Dawn slowly brightened the eastern sky as the final pumps reduced their output. The rain stopped. The lake had fallen more than an arm's span below the spillway edge. The engineer signed the report, confirming that the structure had passed through immediate danger. The dam stood beneath the sunrise like an old animal rescued from a wound that someone had spent years cultivating inside it. And that morning, according to the school's safety notice issued at daybreak, the children of Cypress Hollow still carried their backpacks to school as they did every other day, chattering beneath trees still jeweled with rainwater, none of them knowing that the night before, their entire town had been held together by an old notebook, an old dog, and a handful of people who had finally chosen to believe one another. In the weeks that followed the night the water rose, the machinery of justice began turning slowly, steadily, and with a force nothing could stop. Using the sequence of markings in the shift notebook and the quarter-folded note, state investigators found Earl Dobbins in a small town in Tennessee, the mechanic from all those years ago, now more than half gray, and when a copy of his own handwriting was placed on the table in front of him, the man sat in silence for a very long time, before breaking down and crying like a child. His 10 years of hiding had not been the 10 years of an accomplice, but of the only man who had walked out of the pumping station that night, terrified of Croft and carrying the guilt of the one who survived. His testimony, together with the notebook, the aluminum tag recovered from Croft's safe, and the documents showing the land beneath the pond had been pledged as collateral, formed a wall of evidence no lawyer could tear down. Alden Croft was charged for both the old crimes and the new ones. Dale Whitaker lost his job, and the 3-letter priority code was permanently removed from the county dispatch system. At the largest residents' meeting Honeysuckle Lane had ever seen, Darlene stepped onto the platform without a badge and without saying a single word about her 30 years in law enforcement. She simply said, "I'm Darlene, your neighbor. I used the trust you placed in me to isolate an innocent man. I'm sorry." She was the one who formally requested that the old flood case be reopened, and the investigation gave her a gift she had never dared ask for. The final findings stated clearly that her late husband had been deceived by an expertly forged report, just as everyone else had been, and his honor was judged by the truth rather than by rumor. The first person to stand and shake her hand was Grayson. He told her that an apology was a door, but responsibility was what walked through it, and she had already stepped through that door on the night she knocked on the homes of people who trusted no one else. With Josie, nothing could be repaired in a single meeting. One late afternoon beside the fence dividing their 2 yards, Grayson told her everything. About Fiona, about the 10 years, about Boston. He told her he had hired attorneys to begin negotiations with prosecutors, that he would leave the organization, hand everything over, and testify, for Maggie, and because he wanted to reach a day when he could stand beside a schoolteacher without feeling that his entire existence was a lie. Josie listened to all of it, her eyes red but her voice steady. She told him that broken trust wasn't repaired with words. "Then prove it," she said. "Not with words." And she held out her hand, not the hand of a woman offering romance, but the hand of one traveler to another, and Grayson accepted it as though he were accepting the most beautiful sentence ever handed down in his life. 6 months later, the Cypress Hollow Autumn Fair was held on the grass below the fully reinforced dam, where a new inspection certificate stood beside the entrance, and a small granite memorial bore the 3 names from that rainy night, including Fiona Hale and the technician whose final words had helped save the entire town. Grayson was now the owner of a real woodworking shop, his hands covered in sawdust instead of power. Darlene helped arrange chairs without giving orders to anyone. Maggie ran across the grass with her hair tied in 2 pigtails flying in the autumn breeze, every so often returning to tug at her father's hand, and then at Miss Josie's, because the 2 of them were standing very close together beside the baked goods stall. Bruno, the old mastiff, who had become the town's reluctant hero, lay half asleep beneath an oak tree, allowing one child after another to stroke his heavy, wrinkled head. When strings of lights came on across the field, Darlene remarked without thinking that it was awfully quiet tonight. Josie glanced at Grayson, then looked toward the glowing windows stretching all the way down the street, and smiled. "No," she said. "It's a trustworthy night. The story ends here, but its lesson remains. Real safety doesn't come from reputation or old authority. It comes from honesty and the courage to ask questions when something doesn't feel right. The past may give us reasons to hate, but only the truth can show us the road home." And genuine love doesn't need a disguise. It needs to be proven through actions, every single day. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and let us know where you're watching from. Share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel to hear more compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Write your thoughts in the comments from the deepest place in your heart. We read and cherish every message you share. We wish all of you abundant health, a joyful life, and peaceful days beside the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.